Some dogs don't wait for their owners. They wait for the truth to come back. The wind moved quietly across the empty parking lot, carrying the faint scent of rain and cold asphalt. But the dog didn't move. Not when the sun dipped low, not when the streetlights flickered on one by one, and not even when 12 full hours had passed with no sign of the man he was waiting for. He simply sat there, a German shepherd with a weathered collar, eyes fixed on the road like it still held a promise no one else could see. Inside the station, Officer Daniel Hayes noticed him through the glass. At first just another stray, but something about the posture stopped him, the stillness, the discipline, the way the dog's ears stayed alert despite the silence, like he was still on duty, and that feeling lingered long enough to pull Daniel outside into the cooling air, boots echoing softly against the concrete as he approached. "Hey there," he said gently, lowering his voice the way he used to when working K-9 units years ago. But the dog didn't flinch, didn't bark, didn't retreat. Instead, he turned his head slightly, and then, almost instinctively, sat straighter, chest forward, eyes locked on Daniel, as if recognizing something long buried, a command, a memory, something deeper than habit. And in that moment, Daniel knew this wasn't a lost pet. This was a trained officer's partner, still waiting for orders that would never come. Before he could say another word, small footsteps approached from behind, hesitant, uneven. And when Daniel turned, he saw a boy, maybe 10 years. Old, thin jacket, hands clenched tight around something invisible, like he was holding himself together more than anything else. "Sir," the boy's voice barely carried over the breeze. "I think he's waiting for someone, but my dad isn't coming back." The words settled into the air heavier than they should have, and Daniel felt something shift inside him, the kind of quiet weight he hadn't felt since he left the force. He crouched down slowly, eyes moving between the boy and the dog. "What's his name?" he asked, keeping his tone steady. "Rex," the boy answered, swallowing hard. "He was my dad's partner." "And for A?" Second, the world seemed to narrow to just the three of them. The fading light, the stillness, and the space where something important used to exist. Daniel reached out carefully, palm open, not forcing anything, just offering presence, and Rex watched him, studied him, then without warning let out 3 sharp barks, precise, controlled, not fear, not aggression, but a signal, and before Daniel could react, the dog turned and started moving, fast, purposeful, heading toward the far edge of the lot where shadows gathered thicker near an abandoned stretch of land. The leash tugged tight in the boy's hand. "He only does that when something matters," the boy said, voice trembling now. And Daniel stood, instincts waking up like they had never really left, watching the dog disappear into the dark. And for the first time that night, he realized Rex hadn't been waiting for his old partner. He had been waiting for someone who could finish what was left behind. Daniel did not hesitate, his boots crunching over gravel as he followed the sound of Rex moving ahead with a purpose that felt almost unnatural in the still night. The boy close behind him, struggling to keep up, his small hand gripping the leash as if it was the only thing anchoring him to something familiar. The air grew colder as they reached the edge of the abandoned lot, where broken pavement gave way to patches of wild grass and forgotten debris, and the faint hum of the city seemed to fade into something quieter, something older. Rex slowed then, his body lowering slightly, ears forward, every movement precise, controlled, as if he was no longer just a dog, but a guide returning to a place he had memorized long ago. Daniel felt it too, that subtle shift, the way the ground beneath his feet seemed to hold a story waiting to be uncovered. "Stay close," he said softly, though he was not sure if he was speaking to the boy or to himself. The dog stopped near a rusted chain link fence that leaned awkwardly to one side, its metal frame bent just enough to create an opening, and without hesitation Rex slipped through, pulling the leash forward. Ethan followed, ducking carefully, and Daniel stepped in last, the scent of damp earth rising around them, heavier now, mixed with something metallic that lingered in the back of the throat. A few yards in, Rex stopped again, this time completely still, his paw lifting slightly before pressing down against a patch of ground that looked no different from the rest, dry dirt scattered with leaves. Nothing remarkable at first glance, but the way he held that position, unmoving, told a different story. Daniel crouched slowly, brushing his hand across the surface, feeling for something beneath, And there it was, not visible but undeniable, a hollow resistance under the soil, like the earth itself was hiding a secret. He used to do that, Ethan whispered, his voice barely steady, when Dad told him to mark something important. The words hung between them as Daniel began clearing the dirt with careful movements, uncovering the edges of something solid, something man-made, until the outline of a metal hatch emerged, worn by time, but still intact, a handle barely visible beneath the grime. Daniel paused for a moment, his hand resting on the cold surface, feeling the weight of what it could mean. Rex let out a low sound, not a growl, not fear, but recognition, as if this was the place he had been waiting to return to all along. The wind moved softly through the broken fence behind them, carrying a quiet echo that made the moment feel suspended in time. Daniel exhaled slowly, then looked at Ethan, who nodded without fully understanding why, and together, with a steady pull, Daniel lifted the hatch just enough to break the seal, the sound of metal shifting against earth cutting through the silence. And from the darkness below, a faint breath of air rose up, cool and still, like something long hidden had just been given permission to be found. Rex stepped forward immediately, peering into the opening with unwavering focus. And Daniel realized then that whatever lay beneath them was not random. It was placed, protected, and somehow, through all the passing days and empty nights, this dog had remembered exactly where it was. The darkness below did not feel empty. It felt patient, as if it had been waiting just as long as the dog above it. Daniel reached into his jacket and pulled out a small flashlight, the beam cutting through the narrow opening and revealing a short metal ladder descending into a confined space. The air that drifted upward carried a faint scent of dust and something older, like paper that had not been touched in years. Rex moved first, placing one paw carefully on the top rung, then another, his body steady and confident, not hesitant in the slightest. As if he had been here before, Daniel watched him for a brief moment before following, one hand gripping the edge of the hatch, the other holding the light steady as he stepped down. The metal creaked softly under his weight, but held firm. Ethan hesitated above for only a second before calling out quietly, "I am coming too," and Daniel nodded, though the boy could not see it, because somehow this was not something he should face alone. The space below opened into a small underground room, no larger than 10 by 10 feet, reinforced with wooden beams that had darkened with time. The walls lined with shelves, and on those shelves sat neatly arranged boxes, sealed, labeled, untouched, as if someone had left in a hurry but planned to return. The flashlight beam moved slowly across the room until it landed on a single object in the center, a folded uniform jacket, carefully placed on a wooden crate. Daniel stepped closer, his breath quiet, controlled, and as he reached out he noticed the name stitched above the pocket, Officer Michael Cole. Ethan's father. The boy stepped forward then, drawn by something deeper than curiosity, his small fingers brushing the fabric like he was trying to confirm it was real, not just another memory. Rex stood beside him, silent now, his head slightly lowered, his posture no longer alert, but almost reverent, as if he understood this was not just a place, it was a message. Daniel shifted the light again, revealing a radio unit sitting beside the jacket, older model, but intact, a faint crackle breaking through the silence, as if it still carried a signal that refused to fade. Next to it was a sealed envelope with Ethan's name written in steady, deliberate handwriting, the kind that did not rush, the kind that knew it mattered. Daniel picked it up carefully and handed it to the boy, who stared at it for a long moment before opening it with trembling hands. The paper inside unfolded slowly, and though his eyes moved across the words, he did not speak them out loud. Not yet, because some things needed to be felt before they could be shared. The room seemed to hold its breath with him, the faint hum of the radio growing slightly stronger. And then Rex lifted his head again, ears tilting, not toward the surface, but toward the far corner of the room where the light had not yet reached. Daniel followed the direction of his gaze and moved the beam slowly across the wall until it revealed something unexpected, a second panel, almost invisible, blending into the wood, but not quite, the edges just slightly misaligned, just enough for a trained eye or a trained dog to notice. And in that moment Daniel understood This was not the end of what Officer Cole had left behind. It was only the beginning of something much deeper. Daniel stepped closer to the wall, the beam of his flashlight narrowing as if the light itself understood something hidden was about to be revealed. The panel did not stand out at first glance, but the longer he looked, the more it felt intentional, like a secret meant only for someone patient enough to notice. Rex moved beside him, nose low, tracing the seam of the wood with quiet certainty. Then he stopped and pressed his paw gently against a single point, not scratching, not forcing, just indicating the same way he had above ground. And Daniel felt that same shift again, that quiet certainty that this was not random. He reached out and ran his fingers along the edge until he felt a slight indentation, barely there, but enough he pressed it, and for a moment nothing happened. Then a soft click echoed through the small space, subtle but undeniable. The panel loosened just enough to reveal a narrow gap. Ethan drew in a breath behind him, the sound small but filled with something deeper than fear. Daniel pulled the panel open slowly, careful not to rush what had clearly been placed with intention. Behind it was not another room, not yet, but a compartment hidden within the wall. Inside sat a weathered metal box, darker than the others, heavier in presence even before it was touched. Rex lowered his head again, calm now, as if this was the piece he had been leading them toward all along. Daniel lifted the box and placed it gently on the crate beneath the folded jacket, the metal cool under his hands, marked with faint scratches that spoke of time rather than damage. There was a lock, but was not sealed, just latched like it had never been meant to stay closed forever. Ethan stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the box, his breathing uneven but steadying with each passing second. Daniel looked at him, giving him the choice without saying a word, and the boy nodded, small but certain. Daniel opened the latch, the sound of metal shifting echoing softly through the room, and when the lid lifted, the air seemed to change, not colder, not warmer, but heavier with meaning. Inside were neatly arranged items, a badge polished, but worn, a set of keys, a small digital drive, and beneath them all, a second envelope, thicker than the first. Daniel picked it up carefully and handed it to Ethan, who hesitated only for a moment before opening it, his fingers more steady this time, as if something inside him had begun to understand that this was not just loss. This was something left behind on purpose. His eyes moved slowly across the page, and this time he spoke, his voice quiet but clear, reading words that had waited in silence for far too long, words that spoke of trust, of unfinished work, of something important that had to be protected until the right person came along. Daniel listened, every instinct inside him sharpening, because the message was not just for the boy, it was for whoever stood beside him. And as Ethan reached the final lines, his voice faltered slightly, then steadied again. If Rex brings you here, it means I trusted you to see what others could not. The room fell silent after that, the kind of silence that does not empty a space, but fills it. Rex sat beside them, no longer searching, no longer guiding, just present, and Daniel realized that whatever Officer Cole had hidden here was never meant to stay buried. It was meant to be found by someone willing to follow the path all the way to the truth. And for the first time since stepping into the dark, Daniel understood that this was no longer just about a dog or a boy. It was about something far bigger waiting just beyond the next step. Daniel did not speak for a long moment after the boy finished reading. The words lingered in the air like something alive, something that refused to settle. He reached into the box again and picked up the small digital drive, turning it slowly between his fingers as the faint beam of the flashlight caught its edges. It was simple, unmarked, but nothing about this place was accidental. Everything here had been chosen, placed, protected. He glanced toward the old radio unit, its quiet static now, more noticeable, like a whisper trying to be heard. And without thinking, he stepped toward it, adjusting the dial carefully. The sound shifted, rising and falling, until a faint signal broke through, fragmented but present. Ethan looked up, eyes wide. "What is that?" he asked, and Daniel listened closely, his instincts guiding him. The pattern in the static was not random. It repeated, subtle but consistent, like coordinates spoken in a language only someone trained to listen would understand. Rex lifted his head again, ears forward, not alarmed, but focused, confirming what Daniel was beginning to realize. This was not just a message left behind. It was a path. Daniel set the drive aside and reached for the keys in the box. 3 of them, each different, one small, one standard, and one older, heavier, marked with a faint engraving that matched the symbol on the files they had seen earlier. Ethan stepped closer, watching every movement, his fear slowly giving way to something else. Something steadier. My dad always said Rex knew things before anyone else, he whispered, and Daniel nodded slightly because he had seen it too many times to doubt it. He walked back to the hidden panel and examined the space more carefully, the beam of light tracing every inch until it caught something he had missed before, a narrow groove along the inner frame, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. He took the heavier key and held it near the groove, and for a second he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of respect for what this moment meant. Then he slid the key into place. The fit was exact, like it had been waiting, and as he turned it slowly, a deeper sound echoed beneath them, not loud, but significant, like something larger than the room itself had just shifted. The floor beneath their feet trembled ever so slightly, just enough to be felt. Ethan instinctively reached for Rex, who remained calm, grounded, as if this was all part of something already known. A section of the far wall began to move, not opening wide, but just enough to reveal a narrow passage descending further into darkness. Cooler air rising from below, carrying with it the weight of something untouched for years. Daniel exhaled slowly, his mind already racing through possibilities, but his voice remained steady. Your father did not hide this for no reason, he said quietly, and Ethan looked at him, not as a stranger anymore, but as someone who might actually understand. Rex stepped forward without hesitation, placing one paw at the edge of the newly revealed path, then pausing, looking back just once, not to ask, but to make sure they were ready to follow. And in that silent exchange, Daniel realized something that changed everything. Rex was not just leading them to what was hidden, he was leading them to what had been left unfinished, something that was never meant to stay buried, something that had been waiting patiently for someone willing to keep going even when the path disappeared into the dark. The passage sloped downward just enough to make each step feel deliberate, the narrow walls closing in slightly as Daniel led the way with the flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness in a steady line that revealed rough stone and reinforced beams that looked older than the room above. The air grew cooler with every step, not sharp, but still, like a place untouched by time rather than abandoned by it. Rex moved ahead with quiet confidence, his paws landing softly, guided by memory, rather than sight, and Ethan followed close behind Daniel, his breathing slow but controlled, no longer driven by fear, but by something steadier, something that felt like purpose, the kind his father must have known when he built all of this. After what felt like 20 feet of descent, the passage opened into a wider chamber, larger than anything above, with a ceiling high enough to let the sound of their movement echo softly. Daniel swept the light across the space and paused. The walls were lined with metal cabinets, sealed and labeled, not randomly, but with precise markings, dates, locations, and case numbers, all organized with a care that spoke of long nights and unfinished work. In the center of the room stood a simple wooden table, and on it rested a map, unfolded and pinned at the corners, its surface covered in notes written in the same steady hand as the letters above. Ethan stepped closer, drawn to it, and Daniel followed, recognizing the layout almost instantly. It was a map of the city, but not the one people saw every day. This one marked patterns, routes, connections, places that seemed ordinary on the surface but held deeper meaning when seen together. Rex circled once, then sat beside the table, his gaze fixed on a single point near the edge of the map. Daniel leaned in, tracing the direction with his eyes until he saw it, a location circled more than once, emphasized, not hidden but not obvious either. As if it had been meant for someone who knew how to look, he was still working. Daniel said quietly, more to himself than to the boy. Even after everything, Ethan's eyes moved across the map, trying to understand what his father had left behind. Not just clues, but a mission, something bigger than a single case, something that had required patience and trust. Daniel opened one of the cabinets carefully, the metal door creaking slightly before revealing rows of files, each one labeled, each one connected. Not scattered investigations, but pieces of something much larger. He pulled one folder free and opened it under the light. Inside were photographs, reports, and notes, but none of them felt final. They all pointed forward, like steps leading to something not yet complete. Rex let out a soft sound again. Not a warning, but a reminder. And Daniel looked back at the map, at the marked location, at the path that extended beyond this room. And in that moment, the realization settled in fully. Officer Cole had not hidden this to be remembered. He had hidden it to be continued. The quiet hum of the underground space surrounded them, steady and calm, and Daniel understood that whatever came next was not about uncovering the past. It was about finishing what had been started. And Rex, sitting still but alert, was ready to lead them there. Daniel stood still for a long moment. The map spread before him like a quiet confession. Every mark, every line drawn with intention, not rushed, not careless, but built over time by someone who knew he might not be there to finish it. The room felt different now. No longer just a hidden place, but a living extension of a man's final purpose. Ethan stepped closer to the table, his fingers hovering above the circled location as if he could feel something through the paper itself. He wanted someone to find this, the boy said softly, and Daniel nodded, because it was no longer a question. It was clear this was not about hiding. It was about trust. Rex shifted beside them, rising slowly and stepping toward the far side of the room, his movement calm but deliberate, and Daniel followed his gaze, noticing for the first time a narrow shelf set apart from the others, less crowded, almost reserved. On it sat a single file, thicker than the rest, marked not with a number, but with a name. Daniel reached for it, the weight of it heavier than expected, not physically, but in what it carried. He opened it carefully, the pages inside filled with notes, diagrams, connections drawn between places and people, not chaotic but precise, like a puzzle nearly complete. And at the center of it all, the same location circled on the map, reinforced again and again. Ethan leaned in, reading what he could, his eyes moving slower now, taking in each detail, and then he stopped, his breath catching slightly. "That is near our house," he said, his voice quiet but certain. Daniel looked up sharply, the realization settling in. The path was not leading away, it was leading back to where the story had started, back to where something had been left unfinished. Rex let out a soft, steady exhale, as if confirming it, and Daniel closed the file slowly, his mind already shifting from discovery to action. "We're not done here," he said, his voice calm but firm, the kind of tone that carried weight without needing to rise. Ethan looked at him, not with fear, but with something stronger, a quiet readiness that had grown with every step they had taken. The room around them seemed to settle, its purpose fulfilled, not abandoned, but passed on. Daniel gathered the map, the file, and the drive, moving with a clarity he had not felt in years. And as they turned toward the passage, Rex moved ahead once more, not rushing, not pulling, just leading, steady as ever, guiding them back through the narrow corridor, up the ladder, and into the open night air where the world felt different now. Not quieter, but clearer. The city lights stretched out in the distance, ordinary and unchanged. Yet Daniel knew something within it was not, something hidden in plain sight, something that had been waiting. And as he looked down at the map in his hand, then toward Ethan standing beside him, he understood that this was no longer about uncovering what had been left behind. It was about stepping into it, finishing it, and following a path that had been drawn long before they ever arrived. Because sometimes the truth does not disappear, it simply waits for someone willing to see it through to the end. The drive back felt longer than it should have. Even though the roads were nearly empty and the city lights stretched ahead in familiar lines, Daniel kept one hand steady on the wheel while the other rested near the folded map on the passenger seat, its edges worn from being handled too many times in a single night. Ethan sat quietly beside Rex in the back, his hand resting against the dog's shoulder as if grounding himself in something that still made sense. No one spoke much, not because there was nothing to say, but because the weight of what they had found had not fully settled yet. When they turned onto Ethan Street, something shifted again. Subtle but unmistakable. Rex lifted his head, ears forward, body alert, not tense, but focused, the same quiet signal he had given before. Daniel slowed the truck, scanning the houses lined up along the road. Everything looked the same at first glance. Porch lights glowing softly, curtains drawn, the stillness of a neighborhood at rest. But as they pulled up in front of Ethan's house, Rex let out a low sound and stepped forward, pressing his nose toward the front door before it had even opened. Ethan moved quickly, unlocking it with slightly trembling hands, and as soon as the door swung inward, Rex slipped inside with a purpose that felt almost urgent now. Daniel followed, his eyes adjusting to the dim interior. The house carried a quiet warmth, not untouched, but lived in, the kind of place that held memories in the walls without needing to show them. Rex moved through the living room, past the worn couch, past framed photographs that Daniel only caught glimpses of until he reached a narrow hallway and stopped, his gaze fixed on a single door at the end. Ethan swallowed hard. "That was my dad's office," he said softly, and Daniel felt that same quiet certainty settle in again. They walked down the hallway together, slower this time, as if each step mattered. Ethan pushed the door open, and the room inside was exactly what Daniel expected, and yet more: a desk covered in papers, a chair slightly pulled back, shelves lined with books and small objects that felt personal, rather than decorative. But it was not the room itself that held the answer, it was what Rex did next. The dog moved straight to the far wall, the one that held a large wooden cabinet, and without hesitation he sat in front of it. Still, waiting, Daniel approached slowly, studying the cabinet. It looked ordinary, nothing out of place, but then he noticed it. The same faint marking, barely visible. The same symbol that had appeared on the key, on the files, repeated just enough to mean something. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the heavier key, holding it up to the light for a brief second before stepping closer. The air in the room seemed to shift, quieter, more focused as he inserted the key into a hidden slot along the side panel. The fit was exact, and when he turned it, a soft mechanical sound echoed through the cabinet, followed by a subtle release. The door did not swing open. It shifted, revealing a concealed compartment within, and inside, arranged with the same careful precision as everything else they had found, were documents, sealed envelopes, and a small locked case. Daniel exhaled slowly, the pieces aligning in his mind. This was the final link, the place where everything came together, and as Ethan stepped closer, his eyes wide but steady, Daniel realized that whatever truth had been hidden all this time was no longer buried beneath the ground. It had been waiting here at home for someone willing to see it all the way through. Daniel did not open the case right away, not because he hesitated, but because something about the room asked for a moment of stillness, the kind that lets everything fall into place before the final piece is revealed. Ethan stood beside him, closer now than he had been all night, his eyes fixed on the small lock case, as if he already knew it carried something more than answers. Rex sat quietly at their feet, no longer alert, no longer searching, just present, his work done in a way only he seemed to understand. Daniel reached for the last key, the one smaller than the rest, and held it carefully between his fingers before sliding it into the lock. The click that followed was soft, almost gentle, but echoed in the quiet room like something significant had just been set free. He opened the case slowly, and inside, resting on a simple lining, were documents, official, sealed, and beneath them a letter, written in the same steady hand they had seen before. Daniel lifted the letter and handed it to Ethan without a word, and the boy opened it with steady hands, stronger now than they had been when this night began, his voice soft but clear as he read. The words spoke not of fear or regret, but of trust, of a plan carefully built over time, of evidence gathered to protect something important, something that could not be rushed or forced into the light. It spoke of patience, of waiting for the right moment, and most of all, it spoke of belief that someone would come along who would not turn away, someone who would see it through. Ethan paused halfway through, his voice catching for just a second before continuing, and when he reached the final lines, he lowered the letter slowly, the room holding its breath with him. Daniel looked down at the documents inside the case, understanding now what they represented. Not just proof, but closure, the kind that restores what was left. Uncertain, the kind that honors what had been carried quietly for too long outside. The first light of morning had begun to touch the edges of the sky, soft and steady, and for the first time since the night began, the world felt like it was moving forward again. Daniel closed the case carefully and set it on the desk, his movements calm, deliberate, and when he turned back to Ethan, there was no distance left between them. Not the kind that had existed when they first met. Rex rose slowly and stepped closer, pressing lightly against the boy's side, and Ethan rested his hand on the dog's head without hesitation, not holding on out of fear anymore, but out of something deeper, something steady. Daniel took a quiet breath and looked around the room one last time. The pieces no longer scattered, no longer hidden, but complete, and as he stepped toward the door, he paused just long enough to glance back at the place where it had all come together, then out into the soft light of a new day, because sometimes the ones who are lost do not leave nothing behind. Sometimes they leave a path, and sometimes it takes loyalty, patience, and a quiet kind of courage to follow it all the way home.